My son sold my workshop for $3,000 in scrap metal just days after his mother's funeral. He said he was helping me clean up my past to get rid of the heavy memories. He had no idea that in his greed, he'd thrown away the one thing that was truly valuable, a secret hidden in my old notebooks worth millions of dollars. He thought he had left me broken and with nothing. In reality, he had just given me everything I needed to build a new future and teach him the most expensive lesson of his life. "Dad, let's go home." The voice was my son Daniel's, but it felt like it came from a million miles away. A heavy hand rested on my shoulder, trying to pull me back to a world I no longer recognized. I ignored it. My eyes remained fixed on the fresh mound of earth on the simple wooden marker bearing her name. Elara. My life, my entire 40 years, was buried under that soil. The world had ended, yet my son was talking about going home. There was no home anymore. Not without her. His wife Sarah's voice slid in smoother and more insistent. "He's right, Dad. You look exhausted. You shouldn't have to worry about a thing. We will handle all the paperwork, all the arrangements. You just need to rest now." Her words were a useless balm on a gaping wound. I finally tore my gaze away from the grave to face them. Cold rain dripped from the edge of the umbrella Sarah held, but the chill that racked my body came from within. Daniel refused to meet my eyes, his gaze darting around the cemetery as if looking for an escape. But Sarah stared directly at me. Her face was a perfect sculpture of sympathy, but her eyes were sharp and clear. They were not the eyes of someone sharing my grief. They were the eyes of someone waiting for an opportunity. "We'll need the keys, Dad," she said, her voice dropping to a gentle, persuasive whisper. "For the house and the workshop. To sort through all the estate documents for you. Paperwork." She spoke of paperwork while my wife's presence still lingered in the air around us. The sheer absurdity of it should have been a warning. But my mind was a fog. My body moved on autopilot, my hand dipping into my coat pocket and closing around the familiar shapes of the keys. The smooth brass key to the front door, where I had carried her across the threshold as a bride. The heavy iron key to the workshop where I had forged our future. They were the keys to my kingdom. A kingdom now without its queen. My hand trembled as I pulled them into the light. For a moment I saw our whole life reflected in their worn metal surfaces. Then I placed them into Daniel's waiting palm. His fingers snapped shut around them, quick and final. Too quick. Too eager. A tiny alarm bell rang somewhere in the deep recesses of my shattered mind. But I was too lost in sorrow to hear it. It was the first tremor before the earthquake, the first crack in the dam before the flood. My name is Arthur, and that single thoughtless gesture of trust was the weapon I handed my own son to destroy me. The front door clicked shut behind me and the sound echoed through the house with a terrible finality. For 40 years, this house had been filled with life. The sound of Elara humming in the kitchen, the low murmur of the television in the evening, her laughter that sounded like wind chimes. Now there was only a silence so profound, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. The only sound was the steady, merciless ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick marking another second of my life without her. I walked through the living room, my hand instinctively brushing against the soft fabric of her favorite armchair. I could almost see the impression of where she sat every morning, a cup of tea in her hand. Her reading glasses were still on the side table waiting for her to return. Every object in this house was a ghost, a painful reminder of the soul that had been ripped away from it. Drifting into our bedroom, I was drawn to her closet. I slid the door open, and was met with the faint, sweet scent of lavender that always clung to her clothes. I reached in, and my fingers found her favorite cashmere scarf. I lifted it from the hanger and buried my face in it, breathing in the last lingering traces of her. It was a foolish thing to do, I know, but for a fleeting moment the crushing loneliness receded. The sudden shrill ring of the telephone ripped through the silence, making me flinch. The sound was violent, an intrusion. I let it ring 3 times before my hand, trembling slightly, picked up the receiver. "Hello." My voice was a dry, unused rasp. "Dad, just checking in on you." Sarah's voice was unnaturally bright, completely out of place in the tomb my house had become. "Listen. I was just starting to look at some of Mom's things, and I found the files for the workshop. My goodness, there is a lot of tax paperwork here. It all looks so complicated. I couldn't summon the energy to explain. "It is," I managed to say. "Well," she continued, her tone brisk and efficient. "Why don't you just let me handle it all? I'll take all the papers for the workshop and have a professional sort it out. It will be one less thing for you to worry about." All I wanted was for the conversation to end, to return to the ghosts of my memories. "Okay, Sarah," I sighed, the fight completely gone from me. "Whatever you think is best." "Perfect," she chirped. "We'll be by tomorrow to pick them up. You just get some rest." She hung up before I could say another word. I placed the phone back in its cradle, and the oppressive silence rushed back in. But this time it felt different. It was colder, tinged with a new, unsettling quiet. For 3 days I had barely moved from Alara's armchair, but on the 4th day a flicker of something stirred within me. It was a pull, a familiar homing instinct. The workshop. It was the one place on earth besides Alara's arms where I had always felt whole. It was my sanctuary, my library of memories, written in steel and oil. I needed to be there. I pulled on my old work boots, the simple act feeling like a step back toward life. I walked out the back door, the gray morning air, feeling crisp on my face. I was halfway across the lawn when I heard it. It was a sound of profound wrongness. A high-pitched, grinding screech of metal being tortured, followed by a sickening, heavy crunch. It was a sound of violation, and it was coming from my workshop. My heart hammered against my ribs. I started walking faster, then broke into a clumsy, desperate run. As I rounded the corner of the house, the scene that met my eyes shattered my world for the 2nd time in a week. A massive, rusted flatbed truck with a hydraulic crane was parked where my delivery bay should be. The large double doors of my workshop had been torn from their hinges. 2 men in greasy overalls were directing the crane's claw, which was clamped around the body of my prized Bridgeport milling machine. A machine I saved for 5 years to buy. The machine where I had taught a 10-year-old Daniel how to carve his initials into a block of aluminum. I watched in frozen horror as the claw lifted it, scraping its heavy base along the concrete floor I had poured with my own hands. With a deafening clang, they dropped it into the truck's bed, a graveyard of twisted steel. "What are you doing?" The words tore from my throat, a ragged, choked sound. "Stop. Get away from there. That's mine." One of the workers glanced at me with bored indifference. "Take it up with the boss, old man. We just haul the scrap." And that's when I saw him. My son Daniel standing near the back of the truck, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He was staring at the ground, at his shoes, at anything but me. Beside him stood Sarah, her arms crossed, watching the whole sordid affair with an air of impatient supervision. I stumbled toward them, my mind reeling, unable to process the betrayal. "Daniel, what is this? What have you done?" He finally looked up, his face pale, his eyes swimming with a pathetic mixture of guilt and defiance. "I'm sorry, Dad. We needed the money. It's just..." It's just old junk. It's been sitting here for years. Junk, I repeated the word, tasting like poison. I pointed a trembling finger toward the workshop, where the crane was now moving toward my heavy lathe, the first machine Alara and I ever bought together. That lathe paid for the roof over your head. That press put you through college. This isn't junk, Daniel. This was your mother's legacy. Our life, Sarah stepped forward, her voice cutting through the air like a shard of ice. Don't be so dramatic, Dad. A legacy is about the future, not a building full of rusty old equipment. We're doing you a favor. You can't manage this place anymore. We're clearing it out. A favor, I sputtered, incredulous. You call this a favor? This is desecration. You sold our life for what? A few dollars of scrap metal. We have needs, Dad. Daniel mumbled, finally finding a sliver of false courage. Sarah and I need a fresh start. This money, it helps. It's what Mom would have wanted. For us to be secure. Hearing him invoke his mother's name in this act of plunder was the final blow. It broke something deep inside me. Don't you dare! I whispered, my voice shaking with a rage so profound it left me weak. Don't you dare speak her name here. She loved this place. She loved what we built. Sarah scoffed a small, ugly sound. She loved Daniel and his future. The past is dead, Dad. It's time you let it go. Her words struck me silent. I stood there mute as I watched them guide the crane to rip the next piece of my soul from its foundation. I didn't shout anymore. I didn't have the strength. I just watched as 40 years of hard work, of love and sweat and dreams was crushed and loaded onto a truck like garbage. When the last machine was gone, the truck's engine rumbled to life. Daniel wouldn't look at me as they got into their car and followed the truck down the driveway, leaving me in the ruin they had created. I stood alone in the horrifying emptiness. The concrete floor was scarred and stained with oil, ghostly outlines of where my life used to be. The air smelled of diesel fumes and violated steel. The silence was absolute. My legs, which had carried me through a lifetime of labor, finally gave out. I collapsed to my knees on the cold, hard floor of my plundered sanctuary, a king without a kingdom, a father without a son, a man with nothing left. The days that followed were a blur of gray. The sharp, violent pain of the workshop's destruction had subsided into a dull, throbbing ache that lived deep in my bones. My house, once a home, had become a museum of loss. I moved through its silent rooms like a ghost, the ticking of the clock, the only companion to my grief. The kitchen grew cold. A fine layer of dust settled on the counters. Dishes sat in the sink. The coffee in the pot was a stale, bitter sludge. I didn't eat. I barely slept. Grief had given way to a profound and terrifying emptiness. There was nothing left to feel. I finally forced myself to look at the mail that had piled up on the counter, a stack of envelopes I had no energy to open. Most of it was junk, meaningless circulars from a world that was still turning. But then I saw it. A crisp, white envelope with a red, urgent stamp. It was from the county tax office. My hands, which had once controlled thousands of pounds of roaring steel with precision, now fumbled with the thin paper. The letter inside was short and brutal. A notice of delinquency for unpaid property taxes. The amount was staggering. The deadline had been 2 days ago. Daniel and Sarah, in their rush to handle everything, had handled nothing. They had stripped my assets and left my foundations to crumble. The emptiness inside me was suddenly filled with a hot, sickening wave of fury. I couldn't stay in that house. I threw the notice on the table and walked out, not knowing where I was going. My feet, moving with a memory of their own, carried me across the lawn to the place where my workshop once stood. The sight was even worse in the stark light of day. The concrete slab was a tombstone scarred with deep gouges and dark spreading oil stains that looked like old blood. The air was unnaturally still. The silence where there should have been the hum of a motor, the rhythm of a hammer, the hiss of a welding torch was deafening. This was the epicenter of my ruin. I stood in the middle of that barren space, and the full weight of it all came crashing down. My wife was gone. My life's work had been sold for pennies. My own son, my own blood, had betrayed me with a smile and left me to drown in debt. The sorrow I felt at the funeral was a clean, pure pain. This was something dirtier. It was rage, a white-hot, helpless fury at my own stupidity, at their greed, at the sheer cruel injustice of it all. My eyes fell on the only thing left on the concrete slab, a single dented metal trash can left behind by the scrappers. It sat there ugly and insignificant, a final insult. And something inside me snapped. A guttural roar escaped my lips, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. I lunged forward and kicked the can with all the force I could muster. The impact sent a painful jolt up my leg, but the explosive clang of metal tumbling across the concrete was a small, satisfying release. The can rolled over and disgorged its contents, a few oily rags, a broken gear, and something else. Amidst the grime and refuse, my eyes locked onto the corner of a dark, leather-bound object. A book. One of my old notebooks. For a long moment, I just stared at it. A dark, rectangular shape lying amidst the filth. My anger had cooled, leaving behind only the familiar ache of exhaustion. With a groan, I pushed myself forward onto my hands and knees and crawled toward it. My fingers, stained with grime, closed around the object. The leather was stiff and cold, but the feel of it was unmistakably familiar. It was one of my old workshop journals. Its cover was scarred and stained with oil as from a dozen different projects, the corners soft and worn from years of use. Daniel must have tossed it out of the office when they were clearing things for the scrappers. He probably thought it was just an old, useless logbook. A wave of profound sadness washed over me. I held in my hands another ghost, another piece of a life that was gone forever. I almost tossed it back into the pile of refuse. What was the point? But something stayed my hand. Some lingering muscle memory, some echo of the craftsman I used to be urged me to open it. I sat back on my heels on the cold concrete and thumbed open the stiff cover. The smell of old paper oil and graphite filled my senses, a scent that was more home to me than anything else. And then I saw the pages. They were not filled with simple notes or inventory lists. They were filled with my life, my mind. My own precise, angular handwriting covered every inch of the gridded paper. There were intricate hand-drawn schematics of custom tools I had designed with stress calculations scribbled in the margins. There were pages of metallurgical notes detailing the results of hundreds of heat treatment experiments, charting the delicate dance between carbon content and quenching temperatures. As I turned the pages, the years fell away. I saw the complex gear ratio diagrams for the Harrison project, the one that allowed me to pay off the mortgage. I saw the early frantic sketches for the titanium struts we made for that aerospace contract, the work that had earned Alara and me our first real vacation. Each formula, each drawing was a conversation I was having with myself. A problem solved, a piece of mastery earned. It was the language I had used to build my world, a language my son had never bothered to learn. I was not just looking at a book. I was looking at the blueprint of my own soul. My thumb stopped on a page with a less technical drawing. It was a sketch for the wrought iron gate with the twisting rose vine motif, the one that still stood at the entrance to our garden. As I traced the lines of the rows, the empty workshop around me dissolved. The air was no longer cold and dead, but warm and alive with the fiery glow of the forge. The rhythmic, ringing song of my hammer, striking steel, filled the space. Alara walked in just as she had 1,000 times before, carrying 2 mugs of tea, her smile bright enough to outshine the fire. She set the mugs down and looked over my shoulder at the journal open on my workbench. "You write everything down so carefully," she said, her voice full of soft admiration. "It helps me think," I replied, taking a sip of the hot tea. "Keeps the ideas from getting lost in my head." She placed her hand gently on the open page, her touch warm against the cool paper. "No, it's more than that, Arthur," she said, her expression turning serious. "This isn't just paper. This is you. Your mind, your skill. The machines are just tools. They can be bought, sold, replaced. But this..." Her fingers tapped the journal. "This is the real treasure. This is the part that no one can ever take away. Promise me you'll never stop. Write it all down. Not just for you, for Daniel, for the future." The memory faded, leaving me back on the cold, unforgiving concrete. Ilara's words echoed in the desolate silence. "This is the real treasure." A sudden frantic energy surged through me. I was no longer just reminiscing. I was searching. My fingers, now nimble and sure, flipped through the pages with a new, desperate purpose. I tore past the old projects, the familiar triumphs, heading toward the back of the book, to the last section I had worked on in the quiet years before Ilara fell ill. And then I found it. The last 20 pages. They were different. The diagrams were not of machines, but of molecules. The formulas were not for tempering steel, but for creating something entirely new. It was my secret obsession, the project I had poured my soul into, the culmination of a lifetime of knowledge. At the top of the final page, in my own steady hand, was the title I had given it in her honor, Project Ellerite. My eyes scanned the notes below, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Lightweight structure, tensile strength, exceeding aerospace grade, titanium near total resistance to oxidation and corrosion. I had done it. I had created a new alloy, a material that could revolutionize everything from aviation to medical science. It was my masterpiece. I slowly closed the journal and held it tightly to my chest. I looked around at the scarred floor and the empty space. Daniel and Sarah hadn't sold my legacy. They had only sold the heavy metal shell that contained it. In their greedy, ignorant rush, they had taken the junk and literally thrown the treasure in the trash. The real secret, the $1,000,000 secret, was right here, resting in my hands. A strange feeling spread through my chest, displacing the cold despair. It was a feeling I hadn't felt in a long, long time. It was hope. I pushed myself up, my movements no longer weak and defeated, but steady and purposeful. Standing tall amidst the wreckage of my past, I looked down at the book. A single, powerful thought cut through the fog like a lightning bolt. They missed it. Clutching the notebook to my chest, I walked back into the house. But this time, I didn't see it as a tomb. I saw it as a staging ground. The ghosts of the past were still there, but now they were not anchors pulling me down. They were witnesses to the promise I was about to make. I walked into the bathroom and stared at my reflection in the mirror. A stranger stared back at me. His eyes were hollow pits of grief, his face was gaunt and covered in a week's worth of gray stubble. His hair was a wild, unkempt mess. This was the face of a victim. This was the man Daniel and Sarah thought they had left for dead. He was not the man who could win a war. Slowly, deliberately, I turned on the shower. The blast of hot water felt like a resurrection washing away, not just the grime from the workshop floor, but the heavy shroud of sorrow that had clung to me for weeks. After I lathered my face with a thick layer of shaving cream, with each steady scrape of the razor, I felt like I was carving a new man out of the ruins of the old one. I was scraping away the grief, the helplessness, the despair. When I was done, the face in the mirror was still old, still etched with lines of loss, but the eyes were different. They held a glint of something that had been extinguished. It was the cold, hard glint of purpose. I put on my best suit, the one I had saved for weddings and christenings. It hung a little loose on my frame now, but it felt like armor. My search led me to a small, unassuming law office downtown, with the name David Chen Patent and Trademark Law written in simple gold letters on the door. The office was cluttered with stacks of books and technical manuals, the air thick with the smell of old paper and ambition. Mr. Chen was a man in his late 30s with sharp eyes and an air of weary intelligence. He greeted me with a polite but brisk handshake, his gaze quickly sizing up my old suit and the weathered lines on my face. I could see the skepticism in his eyes before I even spoke. To him, I was just another old man with a half-baked idea, another hour of his day wasted. "I am here to file a patent," I said, my voice steady and clear. "Of course," he replied, gesturing to a chair. "And what is the nature of your invention, Mr. Arthur?" "My name is Arthur, and it is a metallurgical formula." I reached into my coat and placed the old oil-stained journal on the center of his polished mahogany desk. The contrast was stark. Mr. Chen raised an eyebrow. "A notebook?" "I see," he said, a flicker of disappointment crossing his face. "Most submissions we receive are digital these days. Do you have a working prototype?" "The prototype and the equipment used to create it were destroyed," I said evenly. "Everything you need to know is in that book." He sighed faintly and picked up the journal, handling it with a detached curiosity, like an archaeologist examining a mildly interesting fossil. He opened it, his eyes scanning the first page with the practiced speed of a man who just wanted to get this over with. Then he stopped. He leaned in closer. His fingers, which had been tapping impatiently on his desk, grew still. He slowly turned a page, then another. The polite, dismissive mask fell away from his face, replaced by an expression of intense concentration. He began muttering to himself quiet, technical terms. Vanadium infusion, non-uniform crystalline lattice. The thermal expansion coefficient is impossible. He looked up at me, and the man I saw was completely different. The cynicism was gone, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated astonishment. "Mr. Arthur," he said, his voice now laced with a respect that was entirely new. "Where did you conduct these experiments, the calculations here, the documented results?" "This would require a significant laboratory." "I had a workshop," I replied simply. "It's gone now." He barely heard me, his mind racing, his eyes fixed on the formulas. He flipped to the last pages. "This alloy, Ellerite. My God. If this data is accurate, do you have any idea what you have created? This isn't just an improvement on existing materials. This is a new category altogether. This is revolutionary." He closed the book, placing it on the desk with a new reverence, as if it were a holy text. He leaned forward, the weariness gone from his eyes, replaced by a brilliant, focused spark. "Mr. Arthur," he said, his voice low and urgent, "we need to move on this immediately. Today. We need to secure this intellectual property before anyone else on this planet even gets a hint of its existence. Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." The months that followed were a whirlwind of focused, feverish activity. The fog of grief had been burned away by the fire of purpose. My life was no longer about looking back at what I had lost, but about building upon the one thing they couldn't take from me. Our first stop was back at David Chen's office. He pushed a stack of documents across his desk that was at least 3 inches thick. It was the final official patent application for Ellerite. He slid a pen toward me. "This is it, Arthur. Once you sign this, your work is protected. It becomes a permanent part of the public record. Your legacy." I picked up the pen, its plastic body feeling flimsy and insignificant in my calloused hand. My fingers trembled not from age or weakness, but from the immense weight of the moment. I looked at the line waiting for my signature, and I didn't just see my own name. I saw Ilara's. This was her monument. My signature wasn't just a legal act. It was a vow. As the ink flowed onto the page, I felt a lifetime of knowledge of love and of loss being codified into an unbreakable shield. I was no longer just a grieving husband. I was the guardian of her legacy. With the patent pending, the next step was to prove it was real. I couldn't afford a real workshop, not yet. With the last of my savings, I rented a small, dusty corner in a shared industrial space on the outskirts of town. It was nothing like my old sanctuary. It was a cold, anonymous box with a single high-temperature electric furnace, a new crucible, and a simple casting mold. It was all I needed. I spent a week meticulously sourcing the raw materials my old connections surprised to hear from me again. Finally, the day came. I stood before the furnace, my old notebooks open on a makeshift table, their pages filled with the language only I could truly understand. The furnace hummed, its heating elements glowing with a fierce, promising light. I watched through the thick safety glass as the metals inside the crucible began to liquefy, to merge, to transform into a single, incandescent, silver-white fluid. The air grew thick with the clean, sharp smell of molten alloys, the scent of creation itself. With steady hands, I performed the pour, a stream of liquid fire flowing perfectly into the mold. After it cooled, I broke the cast. Resting in my palm was a small, perfect ingot of Ellerite. It was beautiful. It was unnaturally light for its size, and its surface held a faint, pearlescent sheen that seemed to shift under the bare workshop lights. It felt warm to the touch. It was tangible. It was real. I held 40 years of my life's work in the palm of my hand. David Chen arranged a series of meetings with potential investors. Most were a waste of time. They were bankers in expensive suits who saw my age and my simple presentation and dismissed me before I even finished speaking. Then we met Chloe. She wasn't a banker. She was an engineer who ran a small technology investment firm. She was young, maybe 30, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held a fire of genuine curiosity. I didn't give her a sales pitch. I simply placed the Ellerite ingot on the meeting room table and laid my journal beside it. She ignored the financial projections David had prepared. She picked up the ingot, her expression one of intense focus. She felt its weight, examined its finish, even tapped it with her knuckle, listening to the unique, high-pitched ring. "The grain structure is almost perfectly uniform," she murmured, more to herself than to me. "How did you prevent crystallization during the cooling phase at this level of purity?" A small, rare smile touched my lips. "Page 73 of the journal," I said. "It's a process of magnetic resonance tempering I developed." Her eyes lit up. She spent the next hour poring over my notebook, asking sharp, specific questions that showed she understood not just the business potential, but the science behind it. She saw the value not in the ingot, but in the mind that had conceived it. The deal was struck not with a handshake of greed, but with a simple, firm nod of mutual respect between two people who understood the beautiful language of creation. A few months later, I was in my new workshop. It was smaller than my old one, but it was clean, modern, and filled with brand new equipment, all funded by Chloe's investment. She walked in one afternoon not saying a word and placed a magazine on my workbench. It was a prestigious industry journal, Advanced Materials Today. She had it opened to a 2-page spread. The headline was bold and clear: Ellerite, the revolutionary alloy, poised to change everything. There was a high-resolution photo of my ingot and a small paragraph mentioning the work of a master craftsman behind the newly filed patent. I stood there reading the words over and over. It was real. My work. Ilara's legacy. It was out in the world, being recognized for its brilliance. I didn't shout. I didn't even smile. I just slowly ran a calloused finger over the headline. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped my eye and rolled down my cheek, dropping with a soft pat onto the glossy page. It was a tear of grief, of vindication, and of a profound, quiet pride. The future had been forged. 6 months passed. 6 months of relentless work, of quiet progress. My new workshop was the complete opposite of my old one. It was smaller, but it was modern, impeccably clean, and vibrated with a quiet, efficient energy. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, glinting off the polished surfaces of new machinery. The air smelled of hot metal and ozone, the scent of productivity, not decay. Chloe and I worked side by side, a comfortable rhythm of collaboration established between us. She had the brilliant modern engineering mind. I had a lifetime of instinct and hands-on mastery. Together, we were turning a formula on a page into a tangible future. For the first time since Ilara's passing, I felt a sense of peace. That peace was shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. An old beat-up sedan, its paint faded, and a noticeable dent in the passenger side door pulled up outside the open bay door of the workshop. It sputtered to a stop, the engine cutting out with a sad, rattling cough. The productive hum of our machinery suddenly seemed deafeningly loud. Chloe and I both stopped what we were doing and watched as the car doors opened. Daniel and Sarah emerged, and the contrast between them and their surroundings was brutal. They stepped out of their failing car and into the bright, thriving world I had built from the ashes they had left me. They looked like ghosts from a past I had tried to bury. Daniel was thinner, his shoulders slumped in a permanent posture of defeat. The cheap suit he wore was rumpled and didn't fit him properly. Sarah's once immaculate hair was hastily tied back, and the expensive clothes she used to favor had been replaced by a worn, faded dress. She forced a bright, brittle smile onto her face, but it couldn't hide the dark circles of exhaustion and desperation under her eyes. They hesitated for a moment, blinking in the bright light of the workshop, before Sarah nudged Daniel forward. They walked toward me, their steps uncertain on the clean concrete floor. "Dad," Sarah's voice was painfully cheerful, the sound of it a jarring intrusion. "Look at this place, it's just incredible. We knew you could do it. We always believed in you." The hypocrisy was so blatant, it was almost breathtaking. Daniel nodded along, avoiding my gaze. "Yeah, Dad. We saw the article in that magazine. We were so proud. We just wanted to come and see you, see how you were doing." I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness. Just a profound, cold stillness. I wiped my hands on a clean rag and looked at them, my expression unreadable. Chloe stood silently by my side, a protective presence. "Daniel." "Sarah," I said, my voice flat and even. The lack of reaction seemed to rattle them. Sarah's false smile faltered for a second before she plastered it back on. "Look," she began, getting to the real reason they were here. We've had a really difficult time. The money from the cleanup, it didn't last as long as we thought. Things have been tough, and seeing you so successful here, well, we're family, and family is supposed to help each other." She gestured around the workshop at the new equipment, the stacks of raw materials, the finished ingots of ellerite gleaming on a nearby table. Daniel finally found his voice, a weak, pleading whine. "I can help, Dad. I can manage the business side of things. You know, sales orders. I could be a real asset. We deserve to be a part of this." It all came from Mom's legacy after all. The sheer shameless audacity of him mentioning his mother's name in this place after what they had done was the final spark. The cold stillness inside me solidified into something hard and sharp as tempered steel. I looked from their desperate, greedy faces to a perfect, newly forged ingot of ellerite on my workbench. I picked it up. It felt light in my hand, powerful. I met their expectant eyes. "You want to talk about legacy?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "You want to talk about what you deserve? Fine. Come inside. Let's talk." I turned and walked deeper into my workshop, leading them toward their final long overdue lesson. I led them to the center of the workshop, to the large, gleaming stainless steel workbench that served as the heart of my new operation. Chloe remained in the background, a silent, watchful presence. The air hummed with the latent power of the new machinery. Here, surrounded by the undeniable proof of my success, I would pass my final judgment. I placed the ingot of ellerite I was holding onto the table. It landed with a solid, definitive thud, a sound that seemed to silence the entire world. Daniel and Sarah stared at the ingot, their eyes wide with a greedy, confused anticipation. They thought this was a negotiation. They believed they were about to be offered a share. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to stand in the space they had tried to deny me. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm, and measured each word, carefully weighted. "Daniel." I began looking directly at my son. "Do you remember how much money you got for my old workshop? For the machines, the tools, for everything I ever built?" Daniel flinched, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. I think it was around $3,000, Dad. It wasn't much, but we thought— $3,000, I repeated, cutting him off. I let the number hang in the air, small and pathetic. "You sold 40 years of my life. You sold 40 years of your mother's unwavering belief and sacrifice for the price of a broken-down car." I paused, then pointed to the small, shimmering ingot on the table. It fit comfortably in the palm of one hand. "This ingot weighs just under 1 kilogram. Last week, Chloe and I signed our first major contract with an aerospace company. Based on that contract, the piece of metal sitting right there is worth $50,000. Sarah's smug expression froze on her face. A short, strangled sound escaped her throat. Daniel's eyes widened, his face paling. 50,000, he stammered. For that one little piece, no. You're lying. That is the difference between you and me, Daniel. I continued, my voice as cold and hard as the metal before them. You looked at my workshop, at a lifetime of carefully acquired machinery, and all you saw was junk. You saw weight. You saw scrap. Because that is the limit of your vision. You see, the value was never in the iron of the machines. The value was in the knowledge of how to use them. The value, I said, tapping my temple with one finger, was here. It was in the understanding of how to turn simple earth into something extraordinary. I walked over to the small fireproof safe in the corner of my office space, spun the dial, and opened it. I reached inside and pulled out the old oil-stained leather journal. I walked back to the bench and placed it beside the ingot. And when you couldn't sell my knowledge, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous level, you did the next best thing. You threw it in the trash. Do you remember my old notebooks, Sarah? The ones you said were just dusty old junk cluttering up the office. This is one of them. Their eyes were glued to the book, a new horrifying understanding dawning on their faces. This book, and a few others you so carelessly discarded, contains every formula, every experiment, every failure, and every triumph of my career. It contains the precise step-by-step process for creating Ellerite. The patent for the intellectual property contained in this book is currently valued at $8 million, and we are just getting started. The number landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. Sarah stumbled back a step, her hand flying to her mouth, her face a mask of pure, sickened horror. 8 million, she whispered the words, barely audible. Daniel looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His mouth hung open, his face was ashen, and a low, animalistic moan escaped his lips. The reality of their colossal, irreversible error was crashing down on them. I saved the final, most painful lesson for last. You came here today, and you dared to speak to me about your mother's legacy, I said, my voice softening with a deep, profound sadness. Your mother's legacy was never about money. Her legacy was her belief that a man's worth is in what he creates, not what he takes. She was the one who encouraged me to write all of this down. I patted the notebook. She wanted me to preserve it. For you, Daniel. She believed that one day you would want to learn. She believed I was building a future for my son. I finally looked Daniel straight in the eye, letting him see the full depth of his betrayal reflected in his father's gaze. You didn't sell my workshop, son. You sold your own birthright. You sold your own inheritance for a pittance. You were standing on a mountain of gold, and you sold the shovel for scrap because you were too ignorant and too lazy to dig. I turned my back on them, then a final irrevocable dismissal. So no. There is no place for you here. You don't get a piece of this company. The only thing you have earned is the truth of what you threw away. That is your inheritance. That is my final lesson to you. Now get out of my workshop. They didn't argue. They couldn't. There were no words left. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, her face a canvas of shattered greed, before she seemed to shrink in on herself. Daniel let out a dry, hacking sob, a sound of pure, selfish despair for his own monumental stupidity. They turned and shuffled away, not as cunning predators, but as the broken, hollowed-out fools they truly were. They walked out of the light of my new life and back into the darkness of their own making. The harsh sounds of confrontation had long since faded from my workshop, replaced by a new, more peaceful rhythm. The rhythmic hum of the digital lathe, the soft hiss of the cooling pumps, the quiet scratching of a pencil on drafting paper. These were the sounds of creation of a future being built one day at a time. The workshop was no longer just my sanctuary. It was a classroom. I stood beside Chloe at the main workbench, watching as she meticulously inspected a newly forged turbine blade made from Ellerite. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her movements precise and confident. She ran a micrometer along its edge, checking the tolerance. The molecular cohesion at the tip is almost perfect, she murmured, her eyes alight with the passion of a true engineer. But there's a micro-fracture near the base, almost invisible. The cooling process was a fraction of a degree too fast. I nodded, a sense of deep satisfaction warming my chest. You have good eyes, I said quietly. Better than mine were at your age. Remember what I told you. Patience in the cooling is just as important as passion in the fire. She looked up at me and smiled a smile of genuine respect and gratitude. In her, I saw not just a brilliant partner, but a worthy successor. The legacy that my own blood had discarded had found a new, more deserving home. Leaving her to her work, I walked over to my small desk in the corner. Propped up in the center was my favorite photograph of Alara. She was laughing in our old garden sunlight, catching in her hair, her eyes sparkling with the life and love that I had so desperately missed. Next to her photo sat the old scarred leather notebook, and beside it a small, perfect ingot of ellerite gleaming softly under the workshop lights. My past, my knowledge, and my future, all sitting together. I picked up the frame, my thumb gently tracing the outline of her smiling face. The sharp pain of her loss had softened over time, leaving behind a warm, quiet love that filled the empty spaces in my heart. I had not only survived, I had built something new in her honor. I had ensured that the treasure she saw in me would not be forgotten. "Are you okay?" Arthur Chloe's soft voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned, looking from the photograph in my hand, to her bright, hopeful face and then to the thriving workshop that surrounded us. This was not the future I had once imagined, but it was a good future, a peaceful one, a true one. A slow, genuine smile spread across my face, erasing the last lingering shadows of pain. It was a smile of pure contentment, of a peace I thought I had lost forever. "Yes, Chloe," I said, my voice filled with a calm certainty. "Everything is exactly as it should be." Arthur's story is a profound reminder that true value isn't found in material possessions, but in knowledge, skill, and integrity. Greed can blind people, causing them to discard a priceless legacy. But for a person of true character, loss is not an end. It is the beginning of a powerful rebirth. What did you think of the way Arthur punished his son and daughter-in-law using their own ignorance? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more meaningful and profound stories like this one.